Welcome, dear listeners, to the Piscean waters of February. In this month's episode, we welcome Mark Hewitt to the Hadean Press Podcast. In his book, Especially Dangerous, the Snowshill Collection, Mark examines a remarkable collection of objects as they evolve through history. He traces something of their origins, detailing their functions, meanings, and most importantly, the alchemical transformations which occur to the narratives which conglomerate about them as they pass from location to location, custodian to custodian. Mark presents the biographies of two men who were vitally important to the curation and presentation of these magical objects, namely Charles Wade and Cecil Williamson, detailing how they came to be in possession of them, how the objects were presented to the public, how they were removed, retitled, and re-storied, and the influences that emanated from them as they experienced this re-contextualisation, travelling from the witch's Garret of Snowsill to the Museum of Witchcraft in Boscastle. If you enjoy this sort of conversation on the arts of the occult and esoteric, then please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We are always very grateful for every little thing that you can do to help us grow and reach a wider audience. I am your host, Matt Hadfield, and I am honoured to present Mark Hewitt to the Hadean Press Podcast. Mark, welcome to the podcast. For our listeners who might not be familiar with you, could you please give us an introduction to yourself and your work?
Hi, Matt. Thank you very much for having me on the podcast. My name is Mark Hewitt, and I am an enthusiastic amateur of many things. But for the purposes of this podcast, I am the researcher and writer of Especially Dangerous, Charles Paget Wade, Cecil Williamson, and the Snowshill Collection.
And Mark, how did you first come to discover or experience magic?
I suppose it's one of those things. It was very slowly, then all at once. So as a kid growing up, I was always fascinated with history. And it wasn't until visiting the Museum of Witchcraft in Boscastle in the late 90s that it really started to resonate with me. Very slowly to begin with. But then once I kind of got to university, I was reading things like Noel Hutton and slowly kind of became interested in writers like Phil Hine and Julian Vane, following a predominantly chaos magic based experimental practice. And then, it was off to the races. I was involved with the Rune Suit group at one point and doing a lot of stuff with the Hygromantia and the PGM, which was really, really interesting. And that's been my bedrock of magical practice since.
Very nice. Well, some significant similarities with myself there as well. So we're here today to talk about your new book, which is titled Especially Dangerous, the Snowshill Collection, which is a somewhat unique book on the subject of magic because it focuses on a rather unique collection of objects which have been collected and curated in a variety of ways by a number of very interesting figures over the past 150 years or so. So for our listeners, could you describe the primary focus of your book?
Yeah, it's a difficult one because it's a book that wears a number of different costumes and hats. It's both a biography of two very, very interesting people. It is also an exploration of what happened when Charles Paget Wade passed away. His parts of his collection were loaned to Cecil Williamson, and then it was the journey that those objects went on once they'd been removed from Snowsill Manor to Boscastle, and the narrative changes that happened in regards to those objects. The other aspect of the book is basically trying to explain why Cecil Williamson changed those narratives and did what he did by exploring his own magical practice, but also the kind of social and cultural things that were happening in and around that time as well, to not necessarily excuse what he did, but to explain the reasons why he may have done these things. But it's also an exploration of museums as institutions, and it does an awful lot of things. I'm hopefully successfully.
Well, I definitely enjoyed reading it, and it is rather complex. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of moving parts in this book. But yeah, what was it that inspired you to create it?
Well, it was the story itself. So obviously, there's that connection with the Museum of Witchcraft. It was somewhere that I visited an awful lot growing up. And when I started visiting various places with my partner, when I met him in 2005, Snowsill was one of the first places that we visited because he was familiar with it as a kid. And the connection between the two properties was established at that point because I recognised that there were objects from Snowsill at the Museum of Witchcraft. And the location from which the objects at Snowsill came from was a place called the Witch. It was a room called the Witch's Garret, which is a tiny little attic room right at the top of the manor. And there's photos of it that exist. The public can't enter it because it's a bit of a nightmare to get up. You've got to crawl through a mezzanine floor and then through a very small aperture in a wall to get to it. So it's quite an adventure getting up to that space. Um, but when we used to visit, the house guides would almost categorically deny the existence of it. So there was always a cat and mouse game of when we'd go to Snowsill Manor to get them to give up various little bits of information about it. So sometimes they'd say, no, it doesn't exist. Sometimes they'd say, it's there, but you can't go up because there's bats roosting in it. And then every now and again, you get someone who would say a little bit about it, like, yes, it was a room where Charles Wade kept his magical items or his collection of magical items, which aren't exactly magical, as we will soon find out.
Mm, mm.
That was the it was that exploring that story and trying to work out what the actual narrative of it was the driving force.
How old were you when you first encountered the collection? Was this at university or were you a lot younger?
No, well, at Boscastle, I would have been in my mid-teens, so I was about 15 when I visited Boscastle for the first time, and Snowsill was a bit older. I would have been about 20, 21.
Mm. And it left
Um,
that much of an impression on you that you
I think
continued to return and get as much information out of these people as you could.
yes, mainly because I'm a little bit irritating like that. If there's something there that is a thread to be pulled, I will pull it. But also,
Mm,
these are places that leave an impression. In goodness, there's still people that go to the Museum of Witchcraft and
mm,
come away changed because it is an absolutely incredible collection. It's an amazing institution, like Snowsill as well. They're very similar places. They aren't. They didn't. Neither of them started out as museums in the purest sense. They were both the collections of enthusiasts. They don't have, or the Museum of Witchcraft originally didn't have a pure museum structure. It was a show, a sideshow, as much as a museum, if that makes sense.
mm.
Um, it was there to entertain, to to educate to a degree, but it was there as a place for Cecil Williamson to explore his own interests, learn more about it from others, but also make a living as well. There was that aspect. Whereas Charles Paget Wade with Snowsill, it the actual manor itself was restored just to keep his collection of cool things in. He
Mm, and
himself
he,
lived in a small cottage just outside of the house.
yes, I
In
was about to say, yeah, he lived just separately to it, didn't he?
yeah, so very relatively frugally as well. Um, Most of his money that he had, most of his time and effort was spent on collecting things. He was quite driven in that sense.
In the opening pages of the book, you do this really excellent job of condensing a modern definition of animism from the perspective of a Western occultist. But notably, you state that magic is carried in inspiration, experimentation, and the staccato beats of practices forgotten, rediscovered, redeveloped, and revivified. It is living, playful, and tricksy. End quote. And I really love this definition that you land on here because it sets magic as this perpetually evolving process that develops and transforms as we rediscover it in history. But that innovation is a prerequisite for it to become instantiated in the
Mm.
modern world?
Thank you very much for that. I think we're both very lucky to be around at this point in time where we are experiencing this magical renaissance, and it's I think a lot of people refer to it as the recontextualization of magical practice. And works such as Jake Stratton Kent's Geosophia have been really, really important to me in that sense. That we aren't just playing with something that is static and is constricted and held in amber. A really good example of this is, you'll know about this grimoire practice, is that, yes, you follow these particular steps, but once you've made contact with certain spirits, you are then essentially off to the races. That those are the things that don't get written down. It's this relational practice that we have with certain spirits and with certain acts, that we do things that then engender new things. It's almost like we've got the containers for all of these things. We just need to fill them and
Mm.
explore them from that perspective.
Yeah, I love that these practices aren't trapped in amber. They're they're part of a greater cycle. Yeah, and it's this by digging up ancient practices and trying them and doing them and breathing life back into them, we start to learn about them in context. Ah, this is why this works. Because if you just read the words on paper, okay, this sounds interesting. But when you actually do it, and then you learn from the experience and you see what comes of it, I mean, that's where the real magic is. And yes, just like you said, like grimoires really were just starter manuals. It's what comes next, which is important. And that's what, yeah, you never read about those next steps. So yeah, perfectly put. But I really love the way that you describe magic here as animated. It's not, it's something that's moving and evolving. And I think that's a really good way of viewing it. So you continue in the book to say, metaphorically speaking, using object-oriented ontologies can be described as very much like the mixing and drinking of a good cocktail. The structure of the glass can be said to be the thematic silo containing the objects described in totality, i.e., Snowshill Collection. The spirits themselves represent the histories of these objects, which blend and merge as the drink is mixed. These spirits interact with the ice cubes, which equate to the objects themselves. And even the garnish can be indicative of extraneous social factors placed upon the collection. From a materialist, object oriented ontology, the agencies of the spirits, ice, and structure of the glass all interact and have effect upon each other.
Oh no, the infamous cocktail metaphor.
Yeah.
Yeah. What I wanted to do with the book was to, again, it comes from me being possibly too much of a people pleaser, but was to extend both a materialist and a magical perspective on what we were talking about, because there are some really lovely tools that we can use from a materialist and like analytical perspective, and object orientated ontologies was one of them. So I've got a very dear friend, Dr. David Harry, who put me onto this particular idea, and it was something that I found very, very useful. So I wanted to kind of extend that olive branch to people who might not necessarily be interested in magic, but I also didn't want to deny magical practice these really wonderful tools as well, because they are great ways to explore how magic may work, but also how far we can push these materialist ideas to the point where we say, well, we can take it this far, but then actually we need to start looking at things from, say, an ontologically flooded position, like Dr. Jack Hunter would proposition. So
Mm.
it was kind of an experiment in taking and seeing how far you could push things before we start to get into the realm of what Jack Hunter would call boggle thresholds and things like that, which are quite exciting.
It makes far more sense to communicate to an audience how they were collected and how they evolved and transformed and how they in turn transformed those around them
Mm.
during the process of their history. And I think that's a really interesting perspective and way of viewing things, that it very focuses on like you said, the materiality of the subject that we're discussing. So, um, like like we said earlier before we started the record button, we won't get too much into the, the technical side of that, but it's a really good way of presenting it to an audience. So I really appreciated reading that. I really enjoyed it. So you frame magic within its material component, which I adore because for me, the expression of sorcery is very much an embodied experience as opposed to a flight to a higher realm or an escape from reality. For instance, when we look at the grimoires, we essentially find lists of material objects which we are to construct and consecrate before contact can be made with a spirit. And I feel like the way that your book describes these objects is as if the environment in which they are contained and presented within is a living grimoire. Could you elaborate a little further on this? And what is it that you mean when you write in the book about big table animistic epistemology?
Right. Okay. So yeah, like you say, the one thing that we try and do as humans is to try and make the intangible tangible. And it's about, especially when it comes to dealing with magic, you are trying to draw down certain powers at certain times to create things that have a specific power. Okay, so those who are familiar with magic will know that there's an awful lot of material culture that goes along with magical practice. There's a long list of famous things that people associate with magic, such as wands, cauldrons, talismans. And I think that's just a manifestation of humans themselves needing to make the untangible tangible, to be able to draw down certain powers at certain times into certain objects to create the effect that is desired of that object. In terms of considering both Snowsill and Boscastle as living grimoires, they can be read in that way. They are the manifestation of a life of collecting, a life of wanting to preserve certain crafts. And I think if you look at it from that perspective, then they certainly are a type of grimoire in that a physical grimoire. If sorry, a non-textual grimoire is probably a better way to describe it. Um, so when we're talking about big table animism, I'll have to refer back to the description Gordon White gives for that, which is the person who coined it, which is basically about considering animism from the perspective of the other major philosophical positions. Um, Animism's quite a big thing in magic at the moment. People may have noticed it seems to
Mm.
be a buzzword, and I still think we've yet to move from the buzzword phase to the embodied practice phase, but we will get there. And I think big table animism is a way of expressing that desire to have it become seriously both practiced and realized.
Yeah, I think animism itself as an umbrella term has been abused slightly in some ways.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's the best word we've got right now, I think. I think that's the best way of looking at it. Yeah.
Mm. It's something that I am trying to use in everything that I do, but it's one of these things that as soon as you start looking into it, it filters into absolutely everything, and it's knowing when to um, use it most effectively.
So your book is broken up into four specific acts and presents a material biography of the collection, which develops across multiple locations and under the guidance of both Wade and the later figure, Williamson.
Mm,
You paint this picture of this dynamic interplay between the objects themselves, the physical space in which the objects are presented, and the manner in which they are curated and presented to the public. It's very evocative. And even though I've never been to see these objects personally, I get a real sense of the atmosphere that you're attempting to convey.
yeah, they're alluring. They really do have. Again, we'll go into this a little bit later when we start talking about the spirit of objects and non-human persons. They are incredibly evocative items, and the story. And again, we'll go into this a little bit, I imagine, as the interview progresses. But the importance of a narrative structure around the material object is crucial. It's this idea that the narrative is the engine which gives these things personality and life, and their relationship between the various people that they have passed through. Um, yeah, it's a really, they've been on a really interesting journey.
Mm-hmm. So could you add something a little more to this, specifically about why you chose to, say, split the book into four acts?
Because um, the subject is so big, it's two biographies as well as an exploration of these objects. I wanted to be able to do them justice, and it felt like it was quite a theatrical story to begin with. Both Wade and Williamson were showmen to some extent, and if you go into both Snowsill and the museum, or if you look at all, they are curated in such a way which is to tantalise and to entertain. And Wade himself was an extremely entertaining guy. He would often, if you were one of the people that he took a fancy to, he would lead you through the house on a tour, which would involve several costume changes on his half. He would jump in and out of fires, use secret passages to go from one place to another. He had characters. We know that in his writing, it's very lightly created a character for himself called Sylvanus of Thuringia, which was his necromancer persona. And there's a really lovely anecdote of when Virginia Woolf visited Snowsill Manor in the 1930s, of how she was not convinced of this particular character, and because of his mucking about, made her late for her train home. Williamson himself, he was involved in the very early British cinema movement, and he's a very theatrical character himself. So it made sense to kind of split it into four acts as a structure. Yeah, I thought it was quite a playful thing to do.
Yeah, I enjoyed it, and because each act has its own focus, you can really like dig into each section of what you're attempting to evoke once all four acts can be comprehended, right?
Mm,
So each moving piece is animated in its own way, and then collectively they produce something more than the sum of their parts, much in the same way, I think, as this collection of objects
mm,
has this same sort of spirit. And I just thought it was a really interesting way to lay the book out. And yeah, very, very evocative and creative. So yeah, I loved that. Yeah, sticking with Wade for just a moment, yeah, you write that he treated the entire property as his theatrum mundi, and that he lived the art and was one with the curation, mutually animated, as it were. Um, yeah, and you've mentioned already the quote from Virginia Woolf, but were there any other particularly interesting characters that maybe came through the museum, or how was his collection received by the public?
yeah, so he had a lot of very interesting people pass through the property, and one of the most memorable anecdotes I can think of relating to that was when the Queen Mother of the time passed through and said that the most interesting part of the collection was Wade himself. He was lucky in a way that he was able to collect for his entire life. His family background was in sugar plantations in St. Kitts, but when his father died, he basically had his mum run it for him. He very rarely, he went over maybe once a year to St. Kitts to spend some time, especially in his later life. Um, but he was essentially a big kid. I think it was his friend, the architect Lutyens, said that he'd never grown up. He was almost he was definitely part of the collection. He was the thing that held it together, and we see this particularly after he passes away. That without him to ground certain aspects of the collection, it becomes misunderstood, and that's one of the reasons why the collection ends part of the Snowsill collection ends up with Cecil Williamson in
Mm,
1965.
Well, before we get to Williamson, how did Wade come to be in possession of all of these objects?
Well, he's as a kid growing up, he writes. The best thing about Wade is that we've got an awful lot of his own writing, and he writes quite wonderfully. He's a little bit florid. It's a little bit saccharine. His poetry, in particular, is very wet, but it's also very sincere. And he writes an awful lot about how his childhood was almost. It wasn't a particularly easy childhood at times, but it was. It was idea. It was. He idealizes the idea of childhood, and it was obvious that he enjoyed being a kid. He started collecting at the age, I think it was 5. I think that one of the first things that he bought and saved up for was a bone shrine to the to Saint Michael, the Archangel Saint Michael, something like that. Um, so he's got this bug at a very early age, and I mean some of the objects that he discovers that he's just going out on antiques hunting trips with his friends. There's one occasion where he goes to, I think it was Evesham, and comes home with several suits of samurai armor that he's just picked up from a plumber's in Evesham. And he was, I think, how some people say they've got the library angel. He certainly had the antiques angel, or that. I think the other part of it was that because he was collecting things that were considered old hat, and he was collecting things that were examples of dying craftsmanship. He kind of belonged to that arts and crafts movement. Um, these things were quite easy for him to pick up, relatively speaking. And he was still paying quite a bit for some items, but things such as examples of old of handmade velvet, or old spinning wheels, or old bicycles. He was picking these up for buttons essentially, and what are now extremely rare and beautiful and handmade items that you can't find anywhere else. They're all at Snowsill. So he's really amassed this incredible collection, which is a homage to the craftsman essentially.
Mm. So you mentioned before that that the Snowsill Manor was renovated by him and that he lived on a small property just to the side of it. Um, how did the manor itself come into his possession?
Wade first saw the property advertised in Country Life magazine around 1916, and whilst he was serving in France during the First World War. And when he got the opportunity to come back and view the property, um, he wasn't able to put a bid in at the time, but when the war had finished in 1919, he was able to put an offer in, and it was accepted, and he was renovating the property throughout the 1920s. It was quite an effort because it was a very marshy area. There was an awful lot of landscaping that needed doing, and also materials were very scarce at that point in time. So it was a very long-term project.
You mentioned as well that there was somebody that was already living there.
Yes, so there was a kind of custodian, guardian of the property. He was a farmer, and I think he used to try and put people off as much as he possibly could from buying it. And so the place was full of potato sacks and rats. And there's Snowsill has a history of several ghosts, and so the farmer would often try and convince people not to buy the place because it was haunted.
But then there's the actual instance where some of the renovators see, is it a monk?
So there's the story of a ghostly monk at Snowsill. It's the typical cowled monk that descends the staircase. Um, but yeah, apparently one of the workers who were then all staying in the attic space was terrified and left the property. But there's a really lovely letter from one of the foremen who writes to Wade over Christmas in the early 20s saying that, yeah, I imagine the ghosts are here and they're hiding behind all these armorial shields in the dining room, but they quite like what we're doing with the place, so let's keep going. So there's this lovely relationship that they have with the spirits of the place.
Mm.
Even might not be approaching them as we do from a magically operant perspective. They are certainly recognizing that there is something there, which
Yeah,
is it's very nice.
yeah, it's what Brian Johnson and Al Cummins might describe as a Stammgeist, a
Yes,
spirit of the
yes.
place. Yeah.
No, that's a really lovely comparison.
Mm, yeah, I thought that while I was reading it because we have this image of them dining or like sitting around in the dining room and all talking to one another and being very congenial and pleasant, and there's no like negative feeling or like terror that might come with somebody having a ghostly experience. It's more like they just live there. They're just these voices that they can hear every now and then, or whispers that they hear every now and then, which I just thought was lovely. So the manor itself already has this quite magical, or this like it has a deep connection to the past, to history, and to ghosts. So it's already animated, I think, even in its dilapidated state before it's renovated. Um, and just to stay with it, because there's a bit from the book that I remember, where when the people were when people were visiting it later, is it Wade who refuses to get electricity fitted into the property?
Yes, yeah. But Wade was very, very adamant that everything should be seen by candlelight. He
Right,
liked the
right.
glint of metals from by candlelight, and he actually installed quite a few new windows in Snowsill as well. So he was okay with natural light coming through, but no, he was dead against electricity. He was
Mm,
not. He belonged to that kind of William Morris school of loving craft and disliking modernity an awful lot. All the all the trappings of mechanization and mass production.
mm,
So, like you say, it's a very magical place to begin with. There's a lovely quote by, I think it's J.B. Priestley, who visits Snowsill in the 1930s, who kind of describes it as like dream drowned in these green valleys. It's a really lovely quote, and I always
mm,
think when thinking of Snowsill, because it gets on top of a hill, but you still feel folded in by the landscape around you. It's this lovely undulating Cotswold
mm.
landscape.
Nice, nice. And so it's here in the the topmost part of the property where we find the infamous witch's Garret.
Yes, as mentioned before, it's a bit of an ordeal to get up there. I've been lucky enough to visit it on a couple of occasions. So, firstly, you go through into a room called 100 Wheels, which is where Wade has his collection of miniature carts and bicycles, which is a really great collection in itself. But you then, to get to the Witch's Garret, you have to get a ladder through a small mezzanine floor. And once you're on the mezzanine floor, you then crawl through a hatch, which is maybe 2 foot by 2 foot wide. And then you open up into this space, which is a very high pitched roof. And your initial impressions when you're in the Witch's Garret is it's quite dark. There's only one very small window, which faces to the west. And after a bit of time, you can start to see there is a wonderful floor painting. There's a magical circle on the floor. And if you turn behind to look where you've come through, you've got these fantastic wall paintings of female and male mandrakes, and this lovely astrological figure of Atlas holding up the cosmos, with the planetary figures painted in red in a band that goes around, as well as some of the smaller paintings as well. So there's
Mm,
very little there now. Most of the items are wrapped and conserved and pushed to the side. There's nothing really on display in there anymore. But there's a very famous photo of it, which you'll be able to see online, that
mm,
really gives it the kind of spooky. It's a spooky old attic vibe.
mm. And there's a lot, forgive me, I forget the name of the artists, but there's a lot of art which depicts witches in the process of casting their spells or doing divinations, where we see, for instance, like a skull being used on the floor in a magic circle, and a hand of glory on a mantelpiece, amongst all of these other magical items. Was Wade directly inspired by this artwork to create the Witch's Garret, or was it something that he created of his own, through his own creativity?
A bit of both. So he was very much inspired by images like you've described. So there's a famous piece called by Franz Franklin called "An Assembly of Witches," and there's also another artist called Jasper Isaac, who did several other pieces. I think one of them was called "The Abominations of Sorcerers" or something. But these are very typical 17th century woodcuts. There's a lot going on in them, but they both have this iconography, as you say, of the withered hand on the mantelpiece and the candles and various kind of magical iconography going on in them. So we're very lucky to know that 95% of the artistic inspiration that Wade had was from one book, which was the um, first English edition of Sorcery, Magic and Alchemy by de Givery, which was published in 1930. That came out. And that has all of this iconography in it. So it has the Hand of Glory. It has the wondrous candle that he would then later make. The images for both the wall paintings and the floor paintings are in there. But Wade does something very interesting with them. He changes the design of the floor painting. It isn't an exact carbon copy of the one in the book. We don't know exactly why he did this, but part of me kind of thinks that he's magically dismantling or disarming it in some way. It's very certain that Wade was not a magical practitioner. He was very, very interested in the materiality, the theatricality of magic, and the stories that it could inspire. But he wasn't a practicing magician. The only things that he would perhaps give a nod to were things like astrology, um, things like horseshoes, witch bottles that he had in the property. He's playing with these ideas rather than being emotionally invested in them. They are a patina of theatricality on the things that he's already doing. I don't think there's any deep involvement in those things. There's also the tarot clock as well, which we could go into if you want to. But
Yeah, so I was going to ask this as a whole question later, but like you said, there's this idea that he diffused the magic circle by not writing the names in the correct place, and we have his birth chart. But
yes,
anyone who's anyone who's fluent in astrology will immediately notice several discrepancies which don't make a lot of sense.
yeah.
So yeah, could you elaborate further on that?
Yeah, so again, I don't know if this is a superstitial. Sorry, it's Wade approaching this from a superstitious perspective, but there is the circle on the floor comes from a French manuscript called the L'Operation des Sept Spirits des Planets, and it is basically a circle with the Alpha and Omega in the middle, and some Latin names around the outside. Wade's added in some additional material to it, but the seals that he's used for the angels have been slightly changed and they're not in the correct places for where they should be. So Wade's purposely changing these designs on the floor. One perspective could be that he's doing it out of superstition because he wants to disarm them, because he doesn't want to be bringing these potential powers into his own house. The other is that it's Wade, the artist, and he just likes the design better the way he's doing it. Um, I personally think it's Wade, the artist, designing things slightly differently because he likes putting his own touch on things.
So, if I understand this correctly, then it was Wade. Wade was just very passionate about the subject, and he may have had some direct inspiration in his past or some genuine encounters with magic in his past. But it was Williamson who was the actual practitioner of magic and who brought his own knowledge and wisdom to the curation of these objects.
Yes, Williamson is a really interesting guy. He is almost infused with magic from an early age. He has several very, very interesting experiences growing up with magic. And by the time that he gets to Snowsill, he's already on his second or third museum. Uh, he's been um, he's been practicing his own kind of idiosyncratic magic for most of his life, and he's just about at this point to leave the Cotswolds. So that's how we meet Williamson at this point in time.
And so, how does he get caught up in the gravity of all of these objects?
So at this point in time, he's just down the road in Bourton on the Water, and his museum there has been there for several years. He's had arson attempts. He's had people campaigning against him to leave the town. He's pretty much done with the Cotswolds at this point in time.
Is that because of the contents of his museum?
Yes, yeah. Um, the museum had kind of courted controversy wherever it went. Whilst it was on the Isle of Man, there was some quite controversial displays regarding the Mau Mau uprisings, which didn't go down too well at the time. He had a flair for the macabre. Williamson loved a little bit of shock horror or schlock horror. It was very hammer horror, some of the displays that he used. But it was all there to kind of draw in the tourist money. The frustrating thing about Williamson is that there is this veneer of camp horror to an awful lot of the stuff that he does in regards to the museum, but there is an underlying current of actual magical practice and actual magical traditions. But he knows that he can't really sell this because it's not the most interesting thing to the tourist. So you've got to kind of not look at Williamson's museum superficially. You need to look underneath what he's doing to kind of get to what he's actually trying to say and what he wants to explore. But we don't know exactly how he was called to Snowsill Manor. All we know is he was invited there to take to give an opinion of the collection that was in the Garret. At this point, Wade had been dead for 4 or 5 years, and without Wade there to kind of give context to the collection, the Garret had taken on this kind of sinister aspect. You've got to kind of remember this is an era where you've got the rise of Dennis Wheatley horror stories. You've got the Charles Walton murder that happened just up the road a few years before that. And these are still themes and topics which people are talking about. It's not necessarily a great seller at this point in time. Magic is very much black magic and Dennis Wheatley and the Ghost of Mendes. It's not, Wicca hasn't become a predominant force yet culturally. So when Williamson arrives at Snowsill, he tells this story that he gets invited and he goes up into the Garret, takes a look round, and comes back with all of the objects. And we know that he doesn't do this. He only takes several objects, the ones that he obviously found quite interesting. And he displays them at Bourton on the Water for a very short period of time, but then moves the museum down to Boscastle. And it's at that point in time where the identities of all these items that came from Snowsill change and mutate.
So what can you tell us about Williamson's early life then? Does he have any profound experiences with magic that lead him to this?
Yeah, goodness, Williamson's early life is quite dramatic. I definitely recommend if anybody's interested in Cecil Williamson to check out the really good biography by Steve Patterson, which I used an awful lot for the research for this. So Cecil Williamson, his first encounter with magic is essentially defending an old woman accused of witchcraft on a village green in a place called North Bovey in Devon, where he hears an argument happening, and he goes to explore and find out what's going on, and sees a woman being beaten. She's half naked on the floor, being beaten by farmhands because she's being accused of bewitching either a cow or a pig, depending on which telling that he chooses to recall. And this woman then he befriends her afterwards, and she teaches him certain things, and she teaches him to I think it's to look up, look down. There are what's the quote? Look up, young man, look down. There are always new things, new ways, something along those lines. But it's at this point in time he becomes infatuated with magic, and he has an experience at boarding school where there's a boy bullying him, and he confides in the school cook about what's happening, and she teaches him this thing called swing magic, which is essentially setting up a swing, putting a small smouldering fire underneath it. The smoke kind of rises up, and as you're swinging over this fire, to repeat a mantra, or what we would call a mantra. In this particular case, Williamson's chant was to take Balstrode away, and he did this whilst swinging on the pet cemetery in Hyde Park. So he's quite an unusual kid. You know, this is what you do on your school holidays. And when he gets back off the holidays, he finds out this kid's been badly injured in a ski accident and never returns to school. So he's seeing that these things have a cause and effect. And there are several other things that happen in his life at this age as well. He's at one point he's doing charity work in the East End, and sees groups of people practicing magic in the East End, which has a big effect on him. And that kind of enforces his belief that it's the magic of the working people. It's not the magic of what he would call art magic. People like Crowley, people like those involved in the Golden Dawn. He doesn't necessarily gravitate towards that. It's the magic of the working people using things to hand that really fascinates him, and that's where he kind of gets his love of the Auntie Mays, as he would call them, these backcountry cunning folk.
Mm. And so later in his life, he comes into contact with Gerald Gardner.
Mm. So in the so after the Second World War, Williamson sets up the museum, and so after the Second World War, Williamson has the opportunity to set up a museum on the Isle of Man, which he takes. And so Gardner turns up. There is the idea that they've met before, but they only have a very passing relationship. And Gardner turns up, and there are conflicting stories. It depends on who you hear from, whether you're taking it from Williamson's account or Gardner's account.
This is
As
a
to
theme, right? Like
yes,
Williamson's stories tend to have like this duality to them, right?
very much so. And
Yeah.
you've got to really read between the lines, take everything with a pinch of salt. He's not a reliable narrator, which is frustrating because the things that when he's telling the truth or when he's exploring magic, he does it with a sincerity of that only comes through embodied practice. But everything else has this patina of half truths about it and big fish stories. So you've got to be very careful with what he's saying. And according to Williamson, anyway, Gardner turns up without a penny to his name. Basically, wants to be a live-in witch to kind of start to sell his books. I think it's High Magic's Aid at that point from the cafe that they've got at the museum in the Isle of Man. And from that point, you start to see Gardner's star in ascendant. Gardner becomes the attraction, essentially, and Williamson's brand of magic or his interest in a particular type of magic gets pushed to the side in favour of what Gardner's doing.
Which becomes Wicca, of course.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
Williamson's take on magic was far more solitary.
Yes, very much so. He kind of belongs to that, what we would call that kind of traditional magic, which is a very broad term, but he's working on his own most of the time. I mean, there are photos of him working with Gardner for press coverage, but it's definitely they are staged photos. Williamson is very much a loner when it comes to these practices.
And yet he manages to produce something which survives today in this really interesting way. And so his take on magic might have been quite different from Gardner's,
Mm.
but it was no less potent, I think. So at this point in the timeline, has Gardner already met Crowley?
Again, it depends on who you're asking. There is an anecdote that Williamson tells where he drives Gardner to meet Crowley at his house, and Crowley chastises Gardner and tells Williamson to keep an eye on him, to not trust him. So there are conflicting reports regarding the relationship between Gardner and Crowley.
Mm. All right, so Williams connected through Gardner to the larger occult scene in the United Kingdom at this time. Um, so does he have a relationship with any other contemporary figures from the British magical community?
Yes, he is writing to, or people are writing to him. We have letters. I mean, the great thing about the Museum of Witchcraft in Boscastle is that they've got a really good archive. Going through that is a real joy. You get a real sense of Williamson's character going through all the letters. We have letters from other collectors. There's a guy called William Painter who has a museum down there who's doing something very similar to to Williamson that he's in contact with. And Painter had the ear of Dennis Wheatley. And Dennis Wheatley kind of, at that point in time, is an authority in all things magic in popular culture. There are several artists talking to Williamson at this time as well. Ithel Colquhoun is in correspondence with him. He's talking to an awful lot of editors for various magazines. He's talking to Michael Howard an awful lot, who would then go on to produce The Cauldron. He writes a lot of the very early. He writes an awful lot of the early articles for The Cauldron. So he is plugged in, but he's not plugged into Wicca, which is the predominant magical movement at that point in time. He, on the surface, he's very diplomatic about it, but the letters that he writes, he's are very much different. He takes a very dim view of Wicca in the letters that he writes.
And so, what can you tell us about Williamson's time as a spy?
Well, yeah. So in the late 30s, he was recruited by a guy called Edward Maltby to investigate the Nazis' interest in the occult. And one of the missions that he tells that he had was to go over and get the address and contact details for a occult publication in Germany at the time, which he successfully does. But during the war itself, he's involved in several different aspects of espionage. He's primarily broadcasting what he called black propaganda, which was false information going out to Nazi U-boats and Nazi naval craft. He's involved in setting up very large transmitters. I think one was called Aspidistra, which he was involved in setting out in, I think it was the Epping Forest, that was. But the main thing he's kind of remembered for is for falsifying false Nostradamus quatrains, which helped to lure over Rudolf Hess from Germany in 1941 on the promise that there was going to be a peace talk between Britain and Germany. And that in turn led to that defection, led in turn to Hitler himself starting something called Action Hess, which was essentially a clampdown on astrologers, faith healers, and anyone professing any kind of magical practice in Germany at that time. So the things that Williamson was doing during the Second World War were really important. Unfortunately, he does kind of tend to gild the lily with certain things. There's certain episodes that he kind of over eggs, unfortunately, during this time.
And there's the other operation as well that you explain quite wonderfully about. Is it Operation Mistletoe?
Yeah, when we're talking about over egging, that's definitely one of them. So this is something that certainly did not happen, but Williamson paints a very fanciful picture of being involved in an operation where he recruits essentially a whole group of Canadian servicemen, dresses them up in cowls, and has Crowley himself reciting certain things in front of the mirror. It certainly didn't happen. This is something that has been fabricated later on in life, but he didn't let that get in the way of telling it, unfortunately.
Yeah, so we get this, like you say, this unreliable narrator quality to everything that he says. So he's larger than life. He's already lived through some really interesting things though. And so it's interesting how he promotes or neglects to contradict some of this information. Maybe that's the best way of putting it. But he's a very interesting character. You said in the book that is it Hutton debunks this.
Yes, yeah. So I can't remember which publication it's in. I think it might be Triumph of the Moon, but the actual book itself escapes me. It's something something Amado Crowley comes up with in the I think it's the 70s or 80s, but
Right.
doing some runs with it. And it's such a shame because he did some really amazing things. There's good evidence that he was actually in France helping the resistance set up wireless communication, things like that. And it's just a shame that he kind of runs with these larger than life escapades rather than concentrate on the things that were really interesting.
Is that last operation the one where he had soil from France shipped over to the UK?
No, no. So that's part of when he was setting up the museum in the Isle of Man. He
Ah,
tells
okay.
he tells the newspaper that he requires a ton of earth from France to create this consecrated circle, and it's strange because he refers to the River Rance at this point in time, which is very close by to a place where he used to holiday with his grandma, and it's a place called the Hotel Cristal. And it's at this hotel that he describes being involved as a young boy in pseudo Gnostic rituals, where he was involved in. Um, I think he describes it as collecting semen from initiates, which is not the kind of thing you do on your holiday with your gran.
Yeah.
But it this kind of I can't remember the name of the town where it's, but it's northern France. It's a holiday town in northern France, but the River Rance is the river that runs through it. So there's a connection there. But this idea that he wanted to import earth um, to as a I think it's more of a publicity thing for the Isle of Man at that point in
Mm.
time.
But it comes with this narrative, right? This history, and we
Yes,
can't be sure where truth ends and the story begins, and vice versa. It's yeah, very it's complex to get through, to read and to understand, but then you have to pick out the bits that you think are the most likely to be true.
mm,
It's just really fascinating reading.
mm.
Very briefly, then, what does Williamson mean when he talks about this idea of the language of silence?
Again, considering he had amassed a really good collection of magical objects, he didn't really write too much about his own practice. But we can piece together through Patterson's excellent work. We can piece together some of the things that he did practice, and this thing that he calls the language of silence, or the language of the dead, he refers to it occasionally, is essentially being silent, having going to certain places, being quiet, and letting the spirits of that place talk to you. I compare it to something that Gordon White brings up in his book as Dideri, which is an Australian Aboriginal practice, which translates as deep listening, and it's something akin to that. It's being quiet with the environment around you and letting the environment talk to you, or the object talk to you. And I think the language of silence was a key component into why those narratives changed with those objects.
Mm. So I think it's fair to say that your book is a form of magical archaeology and material anthropology, and poring over these really liminal objects, learning about their history and the relevance to both Wade and Williamson, and the way in which they contextualize and animate them. While you were writing this book, did you ever feel the shades of these men drawing close to you?
Yes, definitely. So Williamson more so than Wade. Williamson was very keen on the project. I met with him several times in Dream, and he's been a constant. And there were several different magical processes. There were several different magical acts that I performed, which involved taking material from one place to another, from the Isle of Man to Boscastle to Snowsill. There was a kind of triangulation of material that was taken between the three of those, um, in order to kind of forward the book. And I was helped out a little bit with advice on that book, Al Cummins. So I owe him a great debt of gratitude for various ideas in regards to that. But
Well, definitely for book magic, yes.
yes, yeah, what a
Yeah.
guy. Um,
Mm.
but Williamson's definitely been on the shoulder for this the entire
Mm.
time. Wade, not so much so. Although
Mm.
again, I count myself extremely lucky to have been able to get up into the Garret and to
Mm.
experience that space, because very few people get to do it these days. So yeah, and again, I don't feel Wade in the house So there are things at Snowsill, but I don't think Wade's there. I think he's quite
Mm.
content.
And have you visited their graves?
I have visited I visited Wade's grave. Wade's buried literally a stone's throw from the house. He's buried there
Right.
with his mum.
And Williamson?
Williamson, I believe he was cremated. I've not visited his grave, but being in with the collection and being at the museum is definitely a strong place for him.
Yeah, yeah, better place than just about any other, right?
Yeah,
That's really interesting. It's really interesting to hear how you use the soil, the dirt, to triangulate between these locations as a form of, yeah, a conjuration or of the dead, but or sort of waking them up a little to say, "Hey, I'm writing about you guys," and having them draw close to you. That's really nice that you took that extra effort while writing the book to include them in its process. So it's lovely hearing about that side of the magical practice yeah, with this sort of material. So thank you so much for sharing that. And of course, yes, Dr. Al Cummings and everything that he touches regarding this sort of magic is fantastic, and he's given me tons of advice as well. Yeah, absolute class guy. So what happens then to the collection, to these objects once they reach Boscastle?
so what Williamson does with the collection is that it becomes atomized. They are no longer a collection of objects. They each take on their own distinct personalities. He gives them new stories, new backgrounds, new names, new functions. Um, they are essentially starting out as theatrical objects at Snowsill. They are props for Wade to perform when he's in the Garret. And Williamson, I argue, continues this theme. I believe that he's using them as stand-ins. This is one of the arguments I have is that he's using these props as stand-ins for items that he's heard of in West Country practice, but he's never actually encountered in real life. So the wondrous candle, which is the wonderful object, it's a forked piece of wood with a candle sticking in the middle of it, and it has a wire sigil behind it. He takes this and it becomes a Hilda Freeman spirit trap, and weaves this wonderful story about it being a lure for moths, which are the spirits of people in graveyards. They are then caught on this wire sigil at the back, and that's when you can talk to these moths and learn what you need to learn from them. There's a collection of monkey skulls, which has a story about them belonging to another witch down in Newquay, I believe. There's all these objects take on different stories, and I think what Williamson is doing is he's listening to the objects in a way. He's asking them what they want to be during this time at the museum, and that's one of the avenues I explore as to why he did what he did. From a magically operant position, that's what I believe he did.
So, of all of these objects, then within the collection, you just mentioned the candle, for instance. Do you have a favorite that has made a specific impact on you in any way?
Goodness, that's like choosing your favorite kid, isn't it? Yes and no. So I think the most striking is the wondrous candle. Obviously, it's got an absolutely incredible silhouette. It's very rustic in design. It's something that Wade has thrown together, but it really punches above its weight for atmosphere. I'm very lucky that so the guy that did the biography of Williamson also is a craftsman, and he made a few replicas that were for sale at one point in time. So I'm very proud to own a replica of of Wade's wondrous candle, which is something that I have used for various magical operations in the past as well. Um,
Yeah, it's quite
yeah,
an interesting object. I'm curious myself. I've been thinking about creating it. Yeah, it's a really cool spirit trap sort of
yeah,
object.
it fulfills several different functions because the great thing about what Williamson's given to us is that yes, we can look back on the historical veracity of where we get this item from. We can look at the prints like we mentioned earlier, where this thing comes from. but we can also use the narrative that Williamson gives to it as well. And we know that people were using this as well. So there's a book by Nigel Pennant called East Anglian Magic, which is published in the early 90s, and he recounts an anecdote where he sees the exact same thing being used in a churchyard in Cambridge. So we know that someone's seen this object at Boscastle, has read what this caption is, and has taken it as verbatim, and has then transported that tradition to the other side of the country. So there's a very complicated dance. There's an alchemy going on here between truth and untruth, and yeah,
this is how magic works. We see the same thing happening in grimoires, right? We see like shreds of detail of one bit of spell or one bit of a ritual being copied and pasted into something else, and then it gets, transformed in some way, or copy error changes a detail and that gets repeated into the future, and then you get different streams of tradition from it. This is the very heart of the Western magical practice, I think.
Yeah, so we get these concretions of narrative form around these not necessarily mistakes. They're happy accidents, and they in turn, this creative process in turn generates momentum for new things to happen. And this is why I will never be overly critical of Williamson. Yes, he can be a very unreliable narrator, but he is giving us these kernels of inspiration, these bits of grit to form pearls of new ideas around, and that's what I want to. That is the aim of this book, is to celebrate those half truths, those little white lies that have engendered so much creativity going forwards.
Bringing the interview to an end, I think I absolutely have to ask about why the majority of Williamson's written material was destroyed after his death. It's such a shame because, well, we know that he had written stuff. We knew that there was material that he'd created. And yeah, and finally, really the last question for you properly is, what was the especially dangerous letter?
We'll go. So unfortunately, when Williamson had his stroke, his personal estate wasn't valued as much by his family as those that appreciated the museum, and an awful lot of material was burnt. Graham King, who was the custodian of the museum at the time, did his best to save as much material as possible and to buy as much material as possible. But for reasons of space and costings, they weren't able to get absolutely everything. Yeah, Graham should be commended for the amount that he did do to save. So as much as we've lost, we have an awful lot because of what Graham King did. In terms of the especially dangerous letter, this is still my white whale. This is the one that is still getting away. So the title of the book comes from a letter that Williamson wrote to Snowsill. It would have been sometime around late 1965, 1966. And in the letter, he says that the objects that he took from Snowsill belonged to an especially dangerous black magician, and they all needed to be burned on a certain night on Neon Hill. And we know that information because we've got testimony from both Professor Ronald Hutton and Dr. Louise Fenton regarding this letter. So we know the contents of it. Unfortunately, despite an awful lot of magical work and actual groundwork in the archives and asking people to look for it, it's not been locatable. But we do know exactly what it looks like. It's on blue Sutton paper, and it's written in Williamson's very, very jagged handwriting. And unfortunately, it's not yet turned up, but it doesn't necessarily change the contents of or the conclusions of the book. It's a very interesting letter because it harkens back to Neon Hill, which is the location of where Charles Walton was murdered. So it's tying into those fears at the time of black magic, and I think it's a way of Williamson borrowing the collection for longer than he should have done. It's again,
liberating it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, well, essentially, he stole this stuff and conjured a way to justify it, right?
Yeah, it's again, stealing is a strong word, but no, he definitely borrowed it for longer than he should have, and arguably at this point in time, it's been in the possession or it's been displayed at the Museum of Witchcraft longer than it ever was at Snowsill.
So we
I
did it a
know,
favor, really.
yeah, it wouldn't. I don't think it would have disappeared at Snowsill. There
Mhm.
are items that were in the Garret that are still in the property. So there's a very famous what was called the Hand of Glory, which is essentially a walrus flipper, which you can still see in a room called Admiral at Snowsill. But that was originally up in the Garret. So but he's definitely given it a wider audience than it necessarily would have done, and he's given
Mm.
it a new life. He's given that collection a whole new life, and it has inspired many, many people
Mm.
to look at these things a little bit more deeply.
Yeah, and so finally, how do these objects survive into the present day?
Well, they do. They survive. They are a little bit battered. So there is a little bit of damage to them following the Boscastle floods of 2004. But they are still holding up. They have their own niche under the stairway at Boscastle. So as you come through what is now um, the annual display area, they kind of occupy this little triangular apse, and so they occupy this little triangular niche which echoes the angles of the Garret, I think, quite beautifully.
Mm.
um, so yeah, they are there, and they are still singing alongside the rest of the collection that
Yeah.
lives at Boscastle.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you, Mark, so much for coming onto the show today to talk about your absolutely fantastic and thoroughly thought-provoking book, Especially Dangerous. For our audience who might be interested in you or your work, is there anywhere that they can find you online? And do you have anything new that you're working on?
Yeah, so I've got a little Substack which I post various little short form essays on, or long form essays as well. I'm not working on anything as big as this at the moment. Quite thankfully, not to be working on anything as big as this is, because Especially Dangerous has been 10 years in the making at this point.
Yeah, 10
Um,
years.
a very long time. So when you're working full time, it's very difficult to get all the research trips in and the writing time. Writing is a very exhausting and long-winded process.
Oh,
Um,
I know.
yeah, yeah, preaching to the choir here. I am working on a couple of things which people might be interested in. So there's a series of essays that I'm writing about at the moment about how the Rocky Horror could be seen as a kind of modern initiatic process,
Okay,
kind of
sounds cool.
comparing, comparing that to the kind of the Greek Greco-Roman initiatory traditions. And I'm also looking to write something about the artist Robert Lenkiewicz, who has several pieces of art at the Museum of Witchcraft. He's another fascinating character that weaves in and out of Williamson's life. So I'm hoping to get some time to spend on writing about him soon.
Well, I look forward to uh, looking at your Substack and everything else that you create in the future. It would be wonderful to have you back on the show one day, Mark, to talk about your future endeavors. But until then, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. Really, really appreciate the time to talk about the book. And also, I'd just like to extend a huge thank you to everyone who's helped me with the book as well. It's been a long process, but the amount of people I've got to meet on this journey and to bother with my questions has been absolutely wonderful. So a huge thank you to Jenny and the team at Snowsill, to Peter, Judith, Simon and the team at Boscastle, and to anybody that I've hassled for information. I really appreciate your time and effort, and most of all, thanks to Ertz and everyone at Hadean as well.
That was Mark Hewitt, author of Especially Dangerous, the Snowshill Collection, which is available now for pre-order from Hadean Press. I think Mark has done a really fantastic job creating a book for both academics and operant magicians. His use of object-oriented ontology in his analysis is a breath of fresh air when considering the tools and items found in the Snowsill and Boscastle collections. Utilizing an ontologically flooded perspective, as Mark says, allows us to become fully immersed in the reality that includes the historical narratives of these magical objects, but also the phenomena which is largely dismissed by modern material rationalist worldviews. It grants a new perspective in which we can consider these objects in relation to and including their magical qualities and the spirits which animate them. I think it's also really important to consider that even though the book is a biography of both Wade and Williamson, it's also very much a biography of the spirits of the locations in which the objects reside. The genius loci of Snowsill and Boscastle play just as much of a role in the evolution of the narrative, and this consistent recentering on the animistic qualities which thread through all of the varied stories is what gives this work so much life. It's what Mark describes as the Gestalt choirs of non-human persons. I strongly recommend those of you interested in the subject of re-enchantment check this book out, especially if you're interested in alternative methods of historical and anthropological analysis, something that Mark absolutely smashes. If you have listened this far, then thank you so much for your continued support of Hadean Press and our global authorship. If you have any suggestions for authors that you would like to see on the podcast in the future, then please leave a message below. And as always, please like, share, and subscribe for more like this in the future. For our March episode, we might have the pleasure of one Eric Perdue, who is coming on to talk about his translation of Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy, astrology, and magic. Until then, thank you all so much for listening. I have been your host, Matt Hadfield, and I will see you all again in the next one.